My name is Gillian Askew. I'm co-founder of Go for Growth. I am a procurement professional by trade. So I think I'm about 27, 28 years into procurement. The first 18 years of my career was spent in private sector procuring on behalf of small to medium enterprises, but also FTSE 250 and FTSE 100 organisations. The latter part of my career has been spent in the public sector. I am, however, also a long-standing small business owner running micro businesses and also social enterprises. And I think what that gives me is the privilege actually of being able to see the issues through both lenses. So I understand the challenge that the public sector is facing, having come through austerity into a global pandemic, lots of climate emergency going on. I understand the challenges that are brought to bear, not least around budgetary challenges, but also I've walked a mile in a small business issues and a social enterprise issues. I understand the process from both sides of the table, and hopefully that means I can help deliver some real insight and some value to everybody, both procurement and businesses. Duncan, would you like to do your introduction?
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. So good morning. My name's Duncan Spokes. I'm the Commercial and Strategy Manager at YPO, and similar to Gillian, I am a procurement professional, probably just about 25 years in the industry now, and similarly started my career in the private sector, working for a major UK life and insurance company, LV. Moved into the civil service probably about 13 years ago, and then I've probably completed the last 10 or so years at YPO. YPO is a public sector organisation that's owned by a number of local authorities, primarily based in Yorkshire and Humber and the North West. And in my current role, I have responsibilities for delivering the strategy, which supports 7 or 8 indirect service procurement teams, and underneath that strategy, one of our key sort of work streams over the next 3 years is how we increase engagement and participation in public sector procurement, through the SME and voluntary sector community.
So we're going to talk about why are we here today? Why are we having this conversation today? Why is it important? And I'm actually going to start at the bottom of this slide. So we're here because the business community, the marketplace, has asked us to table this topic. 25% of businesses that we've spoken to and Go for Growth in various channels and in different guises are talking to hundreds and thousands of businesses actually, and 25% of those businesses said that they would in effect decline to bid if they were asked to get more accreditations. So we're tabling that today because it's important that we have the debate and we try and get some understanding and some support into the marketplace around it. But of course, the economic landscape that we're in can't escape us at the moment. And I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but the government did set a mandate to place 33% of all business with SMEs by 2022, and that's alongside or as part of delivering public good social value. I'll talk about that in a second. And that's a good measure for all. We know through Go for Growth that working with lots of authorities, whether that's local government, health authorities, police authorities, and public sector buying organisations, that actually a lot of the ambitions far outstrip 33% as a number. But if we think about actually where the progress is to that number from central government at the minute, direct awarded spend through central government to SMEs is currently a little over 11%. And whilst that might meet with some sighs of, oh, we're not there yet, actually for me, that's a really good opportunity. That is a positive. There is more to do. And the focus is really mounting through all of the public sector. If we think that 33% could be an average number or amount of business that is awarded to SMEs in the voluntary sector through all of public sector, given that the public sector market is worth around 290, 300 billion, that would equate to roughly a market size specifically for smaller organisations of any standing of around 92 billion. And that's a good economic landscape to be thinking about. And of course, that's especially good when we think about the impact of the global pandemic. The Federation of Small Businesses, FSB, are suggesting that 250,000 small businesses will cease to trade as a direct result of the pandemic. That's 5% of the small business market. And a further 23% of businesses, when polled, they told the Federation of Small Businesses that they've had to cut their staffing numbers in order just to try and survive the global pandemic. So I know people often say it, but there genuinely has never been a better time to really think about the process of being open for business in the public sector. And if we think about that public good and social value, the way I try and think about it is, if you think about the big ticket items like homelessness, worklessness, poverty, if we're going to resolve those issues, we can't do that without a stable and growing local economy. And actually, the public sector is a stable market. Now more than ever, volatility is not our friend. What we really need is stability. Public services will always be procured ad infinitum. And actually, it has been a bit of a growing market. So whilst there is no shortage of budgetary pressure for sure, actually what is being spent is growing. And so it is a stable market. It could be a really great time if you're a small business or a voluntary sector organisation to think about diversifying into the public sector if you haven't already. And I think the positive of COVID that we've seen from a business and economic perspective, if there are any, is that small businesses have really shown themselves to be super flexible and really responsive. Actually, when everything flew up in the air, smaller organisations were there saying, we can help, we can do, we're here, we're flexible and we're responsive, and also we're innovative. And that's the key to 21st century public service delivery, is actually capitalising on that innovation, that responsiveness, and helping to build resilience for the future. So they're all, I think, really good and compelling reasons why we should talk about these things today, and to help try and demystify the public sector as a place to go do business. So I'll tell you a little bit about the Go for Growth programme. So the first thing to say is the Go for Growth programme is a funded programme. It's a fully funded programme. And what I mean by that is that public sector participants fund Go for Growth so that the different channels that we utilise can be offered, and all of the support, all of the tools, all of the resources, all of the guidances, coaching, whatever it is that you might take out of the programme, all of that is funded by the public sector. So there is no cost to businesses or organisations that take part in the programme. And that feels really important to both the public sector, but also to us as a Go for Growth team. All too often, support might come out with one hand and a price tag will come round with the other. But actually in Go for Growth, that's not the case. You can be really happy and confident that you can take out of the programme what will help your business at absolutely zero cost. And that's not because it's free, but it's because the public sector are funding it. And they're funding it as a part of a real tangible commitment to doing the right things with the small business community and the voluntary sector, to learning about how to be open for business, and for doing the things that really help deliver stable and sustained growth to businesses' bottom lines and top lines, and to underpinning the social missions of all of the organisations that the public sector work for. There are a number of ways that you can get involved in the Go for Growth programme. So we have events like today. We are running some surgeries and clinics which are actually really focusing on topical items. So we'll be running a clinic, for example, on the new regulatory environment. So we're expecting a white paper to come out by the end of this year. And then we're expecting the regs to be assented to law, I reckon about April, May time, I think the Cabinet Office are saying. So we'll run a clinic that will help articulate what that actually means and what we should be expecting as small businesses from the new regulatory environment. We'll also run surgeries around specific procurement events or specific sectors. So if you're a business who is looking to work for a local authority or an NHS authority and you're in construction, for example, we'll be running some very specific clinics around what that means to your sector. We also have a self-service portal, the Go for Growth action planning tool, that covers the 6 topics that you can see on screen. And in effect, this has been designed with just 3 simple stages in it, and it acts as a bit of a gap analysis for a business. often small businesses say to us, actually, I don't know what I don't know. So I don't know what the barriers are. I don't know what I'm challenged by. I haven't yet done it, or actually I found this really difficult when I did try and do it, and I don't know if I've overcome that yet. Well, the Go for Growth Action Planning tool really supports you in terms of how you figure out that gap analysis. So just 3 steps, you can see them on screen. We capture a little bit about you. We then take you through the 6 sections and you choose the issue statements. We've crowdsourced those from thousands of businesses. You choose the issues that are most relevant to you. And then based on the first 2 things that you've told us, you get lots of guidance, support. There's videos, there's templates, there's how-to guides, there's events to go to. There's lots of things in there that would help you overcome that barrier or challenge. But also we amalgamate all of the intelligence that we get out of all of the channels that we work in, and we take that feedback and we present that back to the public sector. We analyse it, we anonymise it, and we effectively, in Go for Growth, we act as a voice of the marketplace to the public sector. So if lots of organisations say to us, actually, we can't find opportunities in the public sector, where do we go to look for them? Not only do we help you with that at source, we also tell the public sector that that's the challenge that businesses in either certain sectors or certain geographies are really struggling with. So to fulfill the ambition of being open for business, the public sector needs to change something at source. So that's our 2-pronged approach, if you like, supporting businesses at source to overcome the things that are standing in your way for growth in the public sector at the minute, but also helping the public sector to understand the things that need to change in order to help businesses moving forward. There is on the last slide, by the way, some ways that you can actually get in touch with Go for Growth, or you can join the programme. So that will be on the last slide for you, and it'll come out with the slide deck. So we're going to talk about 3 sections now, all around building credibility, looking at accreditations, and we're just going to start with exclusions. And if you have bid before, you're likely either in the selection questionnaire or in the ITT, the invitation to tender, you will have seen grounds for either mandatory exclusion or discretionary exclusion. And it's worth understanding these before you bid. There's a list on the screen that you can read through. There is a definition for other offences, which is not particularly helpful. It's a definition in law. But what is, I think, meaningful, and one of the things we wanted to bring up today, there is a proposal from the government to investigate the feasibility of developing a central debarment list, which in effect would act as a list of disqualified suppliers. And it would principally be a list of suppliers that have been disqualified under the mandatory exclusion grounds, although there is some talk that that could be developed further to include some of the suitable discretionary exclusion grounds. Now, in principle, that would be helpful to contracting authorities because it would ease the burden on those individual contracting authorities to understand where people are. It does, however, also, I think, promote consistency. And consistency in application is often a problem. And when it's a problem, it can really bite. So as a business going into the bidding space, it's worth understanding these mandatory exclusions, but it's also worth having an eye out for the central debarment list if, in effect, it does go forward under the new regulatory environment. Duncan, do you want to add anything to mandatories before I move on to discretionary?
Thanks, Gillian. I think what I would just add there in terms of mandatory exclusions across the UK public sector, most organisations when they're going out to tender, certainly for high value contracts, is actually the mandatory exclusions will probably be the same. So once small enterprises, businesses, charitable organisations have actually, got their head round the selection criteria, how they are presented, it should actually become quite straightforward moving forward. So say, for example, you're responding to a tender opportunity from Wakefield Council, the mandatory exclusions would then probably look the same if you're responding to an opportunity from Kirklees Council. So I think it's really important that organisations don't view the mandatory exclusions as a barrier, because actually a lot of those generic things that are on screen now around terrorist offences, money laundering, are applicable. yes, you may see some mandatory exclusions that are developed that are contract specific, but certainly don't let the mandatory exclusions put you off from tendering, because, as I say, they are consistent and they are applied across the sector.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you, Duncan. In terms of discretionary exclusions, you can see on screen some examples of what would be an exclusion ground from a discretionary basis. Some things to note, I think, the current discretionary exclusion grounds for past poor performance, that's been proposed to be broadened to include a wider range of instances that could be taken into account. And also there's a proposal to implement a system to require contracting authorities to evaluate contract performance specifically based on a set of key performance indicators. And the results of that could be then published or held on some sort of central database. Now, KPIs are not new. They've been around since forever. You should always know what the KPIs are that you are likely to be judged on before you take the contract out. Those things shouldn't come as a surprise. You should know how you're going to be measured from a performance perspective, and especially if those things are contractual. And contract management isn't a new concept in procurement, but it is, if I'm being brutally honest, as a procurement professional, there's real degrees of how well it's done and how it's applied, and it is often done differently organisation to organisation. There is a real growth area in contract management, actually, for that to be much more consistent. So the Cabinet Office are doing lots of training around contract management. As a small business who has worked for the public sector, contract management can be a really positive and helpful and useful process to go through. It shouldn't necessarily be perceived as the stick that someone should beat you with in terms of performance. Of course, if there are performance issues in that contract, then those things should be worked out. But this largely should be a very positive environment for both the contracting authority and the provider to that organisation. And it should not be full of surprises whatsoever. I think one thing that I want businesses to be aware, and I've seen this so many times, I've been approached as a small business myself to do it. Some procurement teams, and usually the less experienced, so this is very rarely, if ever, something that's done as a known entity, but you might get asked to write something like a specification for something that will ultimately then go on to be competed. That can sometimes slip through the net and catch a provider out. If you write a specification, effectively what you're getting is unfair advantage. And it's really difficult then for that to be competed fairly. So there's a bit of an acid test for me as a small business. If it's just me that's being asked to do something, then I might question it or seek some advice around it. But if the invitation that I'm being given is open to lots of people or all of the market, then generally it's fine. So things like market engagement events or pre-market engagement exercises where you might be asked to fill out a document, because they're going out to anybody who wants to fill them in, there's literally no problem with that. But if somebody says, actually, will you help us write the specification for this classroom fit out or this new build over here or this service, then I would probably take some advice before you do it, because it can just end up being a conflict of interest in a way that you never intended it to be. Also, the government is proposing to simplify the selection stage, and I'm expecting lots of businesses to hear that and go, hallelujah, that would be great. There's something called the Tell Us Once project that the Cabinet Office are running. But basically, if there is a central platform, it would do a number of things. It would reduce duplication, as suppliers would only submit your information once. And then for selection criteria, contracting authorities could apply selection criteria to that centrally held information when selecting suppliers. So it could actually, if that actually happens, that could provide some real benefits to both the public sector and to the market. But there's this measurement that we talk about a lot, and there's lots of measurement for businesses working in a public sector all the way through the processes, from selection right the way through to contract management. And one of the things that Go for Growth is doing is encouraging debate with the public sector around actually how would the market measure your performance as a contracting authority? How are you to work with? Small businesses have got very little time. So actually, as part of the planning process, and we really encourage this planning process, how might we choose who we want our customer to be? How might we choose who is good to work for? And there are some mechanisms for measuring stuff. So, payment times are a known and traditional measure of performance in a customer. But we're really starting the debate in terms of should this measurement be much more reciprocal? And it's a question I'd really like to open to Duncan in terms of your own view on measuring framework providers or contracting authorities as customers. Do you have any thoughts on if that should be more reciprocal, and if so, how that might look?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the way that YPO operates as a framework provider, we don't have any mandates, so in terms of organisations wanting to work with YPO, they'll actually work with YPO based on the credibility of us as an individual organisation. So we actually put a lot of emphasis on the pre-procurement phase, where we actually engage with organisations, and if we were looking at exclusion, for example, how we engage with the supply market, how we engage with customers to enable us to actually put those solutions together. And obviously the ultimate measurement for us as a commercial business that's owned by the local by the public sector, local authorities within there, it's the value of spend that we've got under management in terms of our solutions and things like that, so we win or we lose by the quality of our deliverables, and I think that's how we're measured.
Okay, that's good, thank you. And is that true of all contracting authorities, do you think, in terms of the uptake is a measure of how successful the procurement has been?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of talk, certainly from the public sector buying organisations, industries. If you look at all their websites, if you listen to all their collateral put out, so CCS, the central government buying organisation, they have very, very public growth figures that they're looking to deliver, i.e. spend under management through their solutions. There are other local authority buying organisations similar to YPO, the likes of ESPO and NEPO, who operate in the North East and the Midlands respectively, and they have spend under management figures. There are also private sector organisations who deliver services for the public sector, working in partnership with contracting authorities who are public sector organisations in their own right, and they're also quite vocal in terms of the solutions that they offer, the social value that they deliver, quoted in monetary terms, and the spend under management. So ultimately, yes, spend under management is a measure, but equally for us at YPO now, we're on a programme where a lot of our measurements is actually around the value that we offer, the support that we give to our customer organisations, how closely we work with suppliers. We're doing a lot of the work at the moment around supply chain risk. It was interesting you mentioned there at the start of the presentation, Jill, the seminar, around we need a period of stability, but at the moment we've got a massive period of instability. So the work that YPO is doing through its procurement teams, understanding the impacts, being able to support our individual organisations through our customer base to help them navigate through those impacts. Hopefully that's a measurement that will run alongside just the value of spend that we've got.
No, that's really good to know. I wonder if, and it's really just amusing, but I wonder if the public sector will do more surveying in terms of asking the audience a little bit in terms of how those, that value feels from a marketplace perspective. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out, I think, going forward.
Yeah, and I think just to sort of jump in, I think, we need to do more of it. And actually the interesting challenge for all of us in public sector, with the financial pressures that we're facing, not just the impact of COVID and not being political in any way, shape or form, but, I started my career at YPO in 2010 on the back of the first round of public sector austerity. So for the last 10, 11 years, against that backdrop of austerity, we've seen headcount reduction, that impacting on the delivery of public services. it's getting that balance right between the delivery and then doing all the contract management activities that you alluded to that allow you to engage and to understand those impacts. So, you know, we have to do more of it, but I think the challenge for us is going to be against that balance of the, you know, the post-COVID financial impacts and obviously the, you know, the unsettled world that we're currently living in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Good points, well made, Duncan. If we move on to accreditations, I'm going to kick this off actually. So there are three questions up there. The first three that really what we encourage is how to think about accreditations a little bit. So what does your business need in order to operate? Are there any things that you must have in order to be compliant? And that might be at contract level or in your sector specifically. But then are there any accreditations that could complement your business and if you're in a crowded market would potentially set you apart? And I'll give you an example of this from a business that I ran, which was a stray dog kennels and urban care farm. So long before the Contractors Health and Safety Scheme, the CHAS accreditation, became mandatory, our business recognised that as a way of being able to say to our customer, you're in a safe pair of hands. We have put some time and effort and investment into being a safe contractor for all of our customers and for all of our staff and for all of the visitors that we have to our kennels and our farm. Now, to the latter part of our life in that business, that was a mandatory accreditation actually in lots of bids, but it didn't start out that way. We also we recognised that there was something called CVAS, which is the Countryside Educational Visits Accreditation Scheme. We were having vulnerable young people on our farm providing respite breaks. And so it was probably never, ever going to become something that was mandated or even a nice to have in a bid or a tender. But it gave us a mechanism of telling our story to our potential and existing clients of the provision and infrastructure that we'd put in place that would mean that we could demonstrate that we could do our job well. And effectively, that's what a bid is. It's your opportunity to demonstrate how you do your job well. And you answer the questions that you've been given for that, but ultimately that's what a bid is about. Today, accreditations, I think, are growing in stature. So things like Cyber Essentials, there's more and more around data, cyber assurance, information assurance, but you can think about being a B Corp organization, for example. You might not be needed to have Cyber Essentials now, but maybe that would be a good accreditation that would set you apart. Net zero carbon, you know, we've got COP26 almost upon us. Our planetary resources are one of the top priorities for everybody. So even if you don't need to have it right now, now is a really good time, I think, to think about the direction of travel, and accreditations can be a really good way to very easily and succinctly demonstrate to your customer that you have one eye on the future and that you are thinking about how you use accreditations to show your business and set it apart. I'd like to invite Duncan actually to give us a little bit of an overview on accreditations. I think this is one of those places where there's just so many accreditations that you can pick from. Lots of businesses ask Go for Growth, well, how do I know what's required outside of the bid? Is there somewhere I can go? And how do contracting authorities decide what they're going to ask for? And then how do they use them once they've asked for them in a bid? Is there something you could tell us about accreditations in that sense, Duncan?
Yeah, so I'll describe how YPO approaches accreditation. So we have a procurement life cycle approach which covers, 4 distinct phases: the pre-procurement phase, the sourcing phase, the contract award phase, then actually the contract management phase. So if you look at those 4 phases, there are 2 really important ones for us as an organisation in terms of procurement, and ultimately the most important is the pre-procurement phase. And actually, what does that mean? That means for us is actually the research that you do into the marketplace to understand the accreditations that are required, that then actually underpin your tender, your specification. So I'll give you an example, try and bring it to light very, very simply. We have a contract with enforcement agencies. So all enforcement agencies and debt collection, things like that, That is an FCA regulated activity, so all suppliers have to be FCA regulated. If you've not got the FCA accreditation, then you cannot operate in the field, you cannot win the business. So if you like, that's the gateway. The other things that we learnt from our suppliers on the pre-procurement phase is a lot of enforcement agencies do a lot of good work around safeguarding. And actually what they're doing is they're working with vulnerable people on a day-to-day basis, and those vulnerable people could actually be, you know, people who are in debt, people who have to manage debt, people on low incomes, or equally in some areas with, you know, diverse communities, you know, people where English is not the first language. So while there are no mandatory accreditations applicable to the industry that talks about safeguarding, how you actually deal with those debtors or people whose, you know, English is not the first language, what a number of the suppliers told us is that they have, you know, contracts in place with organisations that help them train their staff, you know, they subcontract out some of the services, things like that. So as you described there earlier there, Gillian, is actually they're using those, shall we say, soft initiatives to help them demonstrate to contracting authorities why they should be the supplier of choice. Now, YPO would never mandate in the tender that you need to have X and Y around some of those soft accreditations. But what we have got, we've got the mandatory around FCA, but then we can ask award questions in terms of testing the capability of suppliers to describe how you would approach, you know, managing vulnerable people, you know, in a scenario where A, they're in debt, and B, actually they may not be able to, you know, talk, you know, fluently in English. So that pre-procurement phase where we can research with the market, we can engage, we can also talk to our customer organisations, the local authorities, the owners and the wider public sector organisations to tell us about the accreditations that they need. That then allows us to build, if you like, the specification and the tender. The contract management phase is really important because when you've actually got a live solution in place, talking to your suppliers regularly, understanding changes in the market, understanding new innovations. So another really good example is financial services. You know, the emergence of fintech companies. So in days gone by, you know, we all used to bank with, I don't know, Barclays, Midland Bank, you know, the traditional high street banks. But nowadays, I'm sure many of us, we've got Revolut, we've got Monzo, and there are other cloud-based apps out there as well. So how do you actually put solutions in place with that emerging technology, emerging companies who, yes, they've got the FCA regulations to allow them to operate, but what else have they got? You know, and you talked about Cyber Essentials, ISO 27001. So it's about spending time with your suppliers to understand. So we use that life cycle phase to establish the accreditations. Those accreditations within that life cycle phase are then signed off, you know, so we can't go to procurement until they're signed off. On high value things that we put in place at YPO, that could be, you know, dual sign off by our owning authorities as well as our management within the organisation. And then also I think that the final thing to say is understanding, you know, what's legislative, what, you know, so therefore does need to become mandatory. We have and what accreditations could be worked to. So we have a crematoria framework at YPO, it's in its third generation. And when that was originally procured, there was lots of talk around clean air, abating mercury emissions. Now at the time when we actually procured it, the legislation wasn't actually in place, but we knew it was coming. So what we actually then had to do was build the accreditation with the suppliers so you will be working to and able to meet the requirements of that legislation probably in a couple of years' time. So it's really using that pre-procurement research phase to make sure that your accreditations that you require are fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point. That whole, and proportionate as well, I guess, is the word that we say a lot in procurement, isn't it? What you're asking your marketplace for should be proportionate to the contract, the sector, etc. Yeah. I think it's a good point as well that not everything needs to be in place for contract commencement. So I worked on a contract recently where actually Cyber Essentials had to be in place for the day that the contract started. But ISO 27001 or equivalent, actually you had 12 months from implementation start to get that standard. So not everything will need to be, and as you say, with the mercury abatement accreditation, that was something that was coming in the future. So there was a number of years to work on it. And so again, I think one of the messages is accreditations are not designed to be a barrier to entry. They're designed to set some standards. So the FCA is a really good example of that. You need that to operate, and actually that is a mandatory, and it's right that it should be a mandatory. But that's not a barrier. That is, that's part of your operating license MO, if you like. But accreditations can be a real positive. There is a notion around what happens if you've got an equivalent accreditation. I had this from a small business in South Yorkshire recently. In a tender, the tender asked for a specific accreditation, and it didn't say or equivalent after it. And the business felt, in their opinion, that the accreditation that they had was at least the equivalent, if not actually it offered more than the one. And they were just really unclear about what to do in that situation. What advice could we give from a public sector perspective if that's a place a business finds themselves in?
I think probably it will depend on what stage we are with the procurement. So let's say a procurement was live and the accreditation that you've just given an example there for, Jill, was being asked for. Potential suppliers or potential interested parties to that procurement have, through the clarification process of the live procurement, the ability to raise questions. And actually, if an organisation has good evidence, good proof to demonstrate that an accreditation, is equivalent to what's been asked, then obviously you can raise it through there. And actually the contracting authority then, is duty bound to actually consider that request and give an informed answer to that request, which is then made available to all interested parties. If you are looking to supply something to a public sector organisation and there's no formal procurement actually out to the market at the moment, what I would sort of recommend is that you try and build a network. So let's say, I currently live in Wakefield, so if I was a small business trying to deliver services to Wakefield public sector organisations, I would try and actually build my network and try and find out who the key operators within those public sector organisations, be it the council, the police, the higher education establishments, things like that, to actually talk to them about my business and what the services are, and then actually drop in those nuggets around the accreditations and things like that. So the enforcement agents that I talked about earlier, they did a really good job with YPO talking about some of the discretionary things that they were doing that allowed us to actually build that tender. So I wouldn't recommend just LinkedIn stalking people and bombarding that way, but try and do your research and try and find out who holds the budget. So who's the head of service, who's the head of procurement, who are the operational procurement people, and try and influence that way. But as I say, going back to what I said earlier, if there's a formal procurement underway, use that clarification process to raise your concerns, your question, because the contracting authority is obligated to respond.
Yeah, and businesses should never be nervous of the clarification question process. There's, no matter what it is that you're raising, there's no such thing as the only daft question is probably the one that you wanted to ask but didn't. It can be a difficult psychological environment in a bidding space, but you don't want to appear like you don't know the answer to something. But every procurement professional's advice that I have ever spoken to is use that clarification question process. That's what it's there for, and we would much rather know, because maybe we've missed something actually. So, please do use that clarification process. I think that segues us nicely into building credibility, but just to say before I move the slide on, there is a link on this slide. There is, at the Your Tender team, they've pulled together a list of probable accreditations per sector, so that can be really useful to go and have a look at if you're a particular sector, especially if you're starting out or you're wanting to think, how might I set myself apart? That might give you some ideas of where you can have a look at accreditations. And so if we think about credibility, this is really about, I think, what Duncan was just saying about setting yourself apart, how you build that credibility, how you tell that story, how you can influence and shape procurements and markets as they come out. In Go for Growth, we have built, one of the first things we did was build case studies and testimonials to be able to say to both businesses coming into the programme and public sector organisations who wanted to work with us that this is what we do, this is how we do it, and actually moreover, here are some of the early results of that. It can be a real minefield actually though, building credibility. And some of our some of the public sector clients, and especially in the NHS, have said actually it can be really good if you have you can showcase who you've worked for before those references. But I wanted to ask Duncan if there were any advice or any good examples that you've seen during your career about how people have built their credibility up. You've just given us one really good one actually from enforcement agencies. Or perhaps you could tell us about how, if you ask for case studies in a procurement in YPO, how you might use them and why they can be important.
Yeah, I think the first thing around building credibility, Gilly, is actually, is doing your research and understanding how the public sector operates, and understanding, where do you want to deliver. You may be a small business in Wakefield, but actually you've got the ability to deliver in the Yorkshire and Humber region. So doing your research and understanding how the public sector works, understanding who the key players are, who the key organisations are, I think that's really, really important, because if you understand who they are, how those organisations put their opportunities out to market, that will allow you to be on the front foot. So my first sort of piece of advice would be register for opportunities. That may be through the council's website, on their supplier portals, it may be on some of their e-procurement tools. So if you contact the organisations that you're interested in working for and with, they will tell you how to do that. I think in terms of case studies are really, really good way of suppliers earning, shall we say, extra points in the tender. So you'll see on all scoring grids within tenders, and it may be a 1 to 5 scoring grid, that 3 is satisfactory and you can deliver, but to score, points 4 and 5, it's the extra evidence against the criteria. Now, my advice on case studies is actually use those to your advantage. Use your case study to deliver a message that's in tune with the organisation that's putting the contract out there. So if it was a local authority, a local council who's got a bid out there, try and weave your case study around what the local council is interested in, what it's after. The other thing you can do as well is, find out who the local economic development team are, because obviously local economic development teams are interested in supporting sort of local businesses, things like that. And I think by using those tools, that allows you to sort of use those case studies, use those testimonials to deliver that value add. I talked earlier about enforcement agencies and safeguarding and where English isn't the first language. We've got another solution at YPO which is around soft FM services. It's a dynamic purchasing system which allows us to support suppliers coming onto the contract at any time through the lifespan of that. And a number of the organisations on there are small businesses based within local areas. They may be providing cleaning services, painting and decorating type services. And what they're doing is they're actually telling a story of some of their volunteering that they do. Some small business owners are school governors, things like that. So actually giving something back to the community through volunteering, or even supporting apprentices, things like that. All that type of stuff is good case study material that demonstrates a commitment and a credibility. You've got on screen their awards. If there's an opportunity to enter awards as well, that can give you good credibility. Can also be a good thing to put into a case study to support that tender.
Yeah, no, and I think there's something powerful about the independence of that as well, isn't there? That if you've entered an award, you will have been independently verified almost, and deemed to be worthy of an award. Even a shortlist is really great. And there is something, having gone through the process, actually, when you're writing down the things that you're good at for an award, it reminds you as a business of that story about why you're good, how you're good, and what you're good at. And that in itself is a really great process to go through. Just before we move on to the next slide, the financial credibility can often be a thing that is scary for small businesses. In terms of, what does it mean? We talk a lot to businesses about making sure that you look at opportunities that are the right size for you. So think about the size of the opportunity versus the size of your business. And it might be that actually working in collaboration with somebody else or in partnership with someone else might be the right way to approach a particular opportunity of a particular size. But am I right in thinking, Duncan, that the financial credibility at its most basic level really is an assuredness for the public sector that there is enough financial stability for the provider to be able to provide the goods or services throughout the life of the contract? This isn't meant to be tripping anyone up. It's really just about knowing that it can happen.
Oh, absolutely. Whatever the size of the contract that we're putting out to the market, whether it's a £5,000 contract or it's a £5 million contract or even, a £50 million contract, it's making sure that the structure of that contract supports a viable and robust supply chain. So again, the easiest way to sort of example that, if the contract, has the capacity to support 100 businesses and it's quite low risk delivery of goods and services, we want 100 businesses on that contract. We're assessing, is the supply, is it a monopoly situation? Is there only one key supplier? We all saw what happened when Carillion went bust, and there's probably a logical argument to say that there was too many eggs in that one basket. So what we're trying to do there is to spread the risk across the supply base to make sure that we can support those businesses, but equally to make sure that as a procurer or from a contract management side, that we're not actually at risk of that supplier or suppliers going belly up. So it's not there to stop organisations getting on board, it's there to manage that risk. And currently at the moment, we've all seen what's going on in the retail energy market, with energy suppliers unfortunately going out of business because of the impact of pricing. We don't want to see that across the public sector contracts. So financial credibility is all about, as you said there, Jill, is making sure that we can support those organisations. We're always concerned about the percentage of turnover to a contract. So if you are a supplier to YPO and you rely 100% on that contract, there's significant risk there when that contract comes up for renewal, that if you don't win that business, you could potentially go out of business. So we wouldn't want to be the organisation that's responsible for putting you out of business. So therefore we need to structure that contract in a way that spreads that risk. So it is all about risk management.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Duncan. That makes absolute sense and really helpful advice, I think, for SMEs and VCSEs. So our last slide before we get on to next steps and Q&A, how to make it work for smaller organisations.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very, very simple model, which I call RICE, and obviously forgive the acronym there, but, I've talked heavily throughout this morning's session, Gillian, around actually research. It really is important for all organisations who want to supply to the public sector is to understand how they approach. Now, there is an obligation on all public sector organisations to publish opportunities. They also will publish what we call their contract standing orders. So YPO is owned by 13 local authorities. Every single one of those local authorities has contract standing orders, which describes how they are obligated or how they will manage those opportunities. So it may be up to say £10,000 they can place the business with a supplier of their choice. Up to say £25,000 they may have to elicit 3 quotes. Anything above another threshold, say above £50,000, it may be a mandatory tender. And then obviously once you get into the high value procurements, you're then bound by whatever the regulations are. So pre-Brexit it was the EU regulations, which are still in force, but obviously moving soon to the new UK regulations, which you referenced earlier. So what I would say is go and do your research and find out about how those public sector organisations, whether it's local authorities, whether it's charities, whether it's police forces, whether it's universities, FE colleges, how those public sector organisations approach. Because what you may do is find out you're missing some of those lower value opportunities, which could be really important to SMEs and VCSEs to actually get a foothold into the door. inform, providing insight into current legislation and the new innovation developments. Talk to us, tell us what's going on in your marketplace, what's going on in your industry. We've referenced some earlier around FSA versus the other non-mandatory accreditations, things like that. And talk to procurement people, talk to budget holders, build your network through the Federation of Small Businesses and other organisations that are in your area. Use that networking opportunity. Lobbying MPs, there's always a good opportunity to lobby MPs, so YPO does a lot of lobbying of MPs around potential legislation and how that may impact. I mentioned a little bit more there around leveraging membership of your trade bodies. Let those trade bodies do the work for you. Engage with the local government association. They're a lobbying organisation on behalf of local authorities as well. So try and build up that network to inform and collaborate. And then when you actually get into the tender phase itself, use those accreditations as your evidence, because the evidence that you can provide in a tender, and I say it all the time, evidence against criteria, that's how you score the extra marks. So your example there, Gillian, earlier around your small business, the kennels, the extracurricular activities you did around day trips and supporting education, that's not necessarily a mandatory requirement in terms of delivering the service to the local authorities, but it added value that allows those organisations to meet some of their social value criteria as well, and it can provide a commercial opportunity as well to the small business. So use that evidence, understand how it adds the value, and use it to your advantage.
Brilliant, thank you. That's such great advice, Duncan, for small businesses. Thank you ever so much for that. In terms of next steps, we have a sequence of events. So we started with finding opportunities. We've looked at promoting organisations. Today we've dealt with credibility and accreditation. So the next thing we're unpacking is preparation to bid. And specifically what we're focusing on is what are the things that small businesses can do before the bid clock starts ticking. It often doesn't tick for very long. 35, 40 days, something like that. So actually, the more that we can do in preparedness for any sort of competitive process, the better. So my colleague Mike Fairbotham will be talking us through in the next webinar on the 2nd of November, what are those things that we can do in slower time that means actually when we find an opportunity that's right for us to go for, we're as ready as we can be. And there'll be a bit of unpacking as well in terms of these are the things to look for in a bid. So that's coming up on the 2nd of November. And I'll just leave contact details. There's the URL for Go for Growth on the screen as well. If you want to have a play around with the programme, there's mine and Duncan's contact details. Do feel free to get in touch. We do have literally a couple of minutes for a question, if that's okay, Duncan. So it was a pre-submitted question. And I think it's a great question because I don't know that there's a ready-made answer to it. But one business got in touch with us and said, actually, accreditations can be super expensive. Is there any funding or is there any plans that might be known about for any funding that might support specifically smaller businesses, micro businesses or voluntary sector organisations in obtaining accreditations that are mandated?
I think you're right, Gillian. It's a fabulous question, and I'm going to give a very blunt answer. Is actually I'm not aware of any funding at the moment. I think going back to what we said earlier around using the opportunity to collaborate and lobby, it may be that depending on what sort of business area that the supplier or the questions come from, is actually using potentially some trade bodies or maybe even a local government association to act as your voice. Particularly if it's related to the delivery of statutory services, and particularly if it is to help an organisation get that foothold in the door. We talked earlier about Cyber Essentials and ISO 27001. The reason that Cyber Essentials was developed and rolled out was to actually support SMEs to get those basic cybersecurity accreditations, and it's a lot cheaper and a lot less time involved than actually doing the full ISO 27001. So while it might be difficult for an individual organisation to find out where to go, I would certainly recommend, maybe Federation of Small Businesses, Chamber of Commerce, or even engaging with the LGA, or even your local authority to try and help develop that as well. There are grants that are provided by central government for various initiatives, so I'm sure if we can find that right lobbying voice, then we could find it. I think it's a really, really great question, and sorry I can't give you any more insight than that.
No, it's fine. I'm not sure the insight exists to be given by anyone, and that's why I think it's such a great question. I think you've made a really good point though about the trade associations and membership bodies like FSB, the Federation of Small Businesses. So I know that they are working with the Good Business Charter, for example, which could be a really good accreditation for small businesses to go and get. And don't quote me on this, but there is usually, if a membership body is engaging with it, that's usually there's a discounted access route of some sort in. But I think you're right, it's a good lobbying opportunity to take and table that to central government and the wider public sector around some of the the funding issues around. Ultimately the bid will pay for it, but that is difficult, as what we really want is not to be building those things into bids if we can help it.
Yeah, definitely. And just want to, if there's any small business out there that wants any help and advice to try and find a trade association that supports their industry, then please do get in contact and we will find that out for you. So for example, office supplies, there's the Boss Federation and things like that, so we can find who those organisations are, and I'm sure they would love to increase their membership base and certainly act to support as that lobbying agent. But I do think funding for accreditations, brilliant question, and something perhaps we need to explore further.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. So that brings us to the end of the session today. So big thank you to you, Duncan, for taking time out of your busy calendar. Thank you to everyone who's joined us, whether you've joined us today or if you're watching this back on replay, or if you're just joining in one of the segments. Again, we know how precious the commodity time is, so thank you so much for taking part and being interested. Hopefully what we've done over the last hour has been of some use and some help to everybody. Thank you, Duncan, and have a great day, everybody.